there's now the ability to generate the commands required to build the same storage layout on a different system, or possibly even just to document what you've done on a system you've just installed. So I'm going to do this on the whole instance. You can select certain DB spaces. So that's the Unix or Linux commands to create the chunk files with the right permissions. Then the onspaces commands to build the DB spaces and additional chunks using those files. Later versions of IDS have DB schema -c, which is more complete, so that will include logical log and physical log placement commands. The advantage of this is this will work with any version of IDS prior to DB schema -c being available. You would have seen in the previous screen where we kicked this off that you can actually redefine the location of the chunk files being created. So you could also use this as a way of creating a duplicate instance with different storage. Next, we're going to look at SQL tracing. So within the instance, you've got a node in the Object Explorer for SQL trace. So the purpose of SQL trace is to have a buffer in memory in which you've got the details of the last few thousand SQL statements for performance analysis in whichever way, seeing what's going on. So first of all, I'm just going to turn it on so that everything else in this screen becomes active. Note that warning. Theoretically, SQL trace will have a small performance impact on the instance. It's not really significant, shouldn't concern you too much. On critical high transaction systems, you might decide to just turn SQL tracing on temporarily, get SQL statement details out, and then suspend it again, and not leave it on permanently. So that's now running. So I'm going to fully configure it. I'm going to so with the in fact, some of these parameters have come back from a previous test, so we can see that here we've said that there's going to be 10,000 traces. In other words, it will store the last 10,000 SQL statements that have gone through, matching the criteria that we define. And each one will have 2K set aside to make sure that we should be able to keep the full details of even fairly large SQL statements. I'm going to choose to have not global but user. Actually, user just means not everything just specified, and in fact you need to set that to user for database tracing to be specified. So if you leave that as global, it will actually ignore everything you do under which databases and which users you want to be recorded. Over here I've said if we're going to do tracing, I want details of everything for each SQL statement, and let's start out by clearing the trace buffer. If I were to look at what we currently got in the buffer with transactions and SQL at the moment, it's going to have what we did when we opened this dialog. In other words, it does cache it. Yeah, unless of course we've said clear under SQL trace buffer. So if you don't do clearing of SQL trace and you want to just see SQL statements happening from that point onwards, you'll need to exit this dialog and come back in. As it is, because we've said clear, then that is in fact already clear. If I then run some statements against the stores demo database, let's say, again in the SQL Trace Explorer, we haven't seen them yet because we haven't loaded the buffer since we went into that dialog. So I close that, reopen it. Then if I go into SQL, we can see what statement's just executed. So right there we've got average runtime. It might have aggregated many executions run one after the other of the same statement, so that's the average runtime, any wait times. So the SQL trace buffer will contain the last few thousand completed statements, so the time there that makes sense is when that statement completed. Should you want more information that's in the SQL trace buffer, then you have a look under the sysmaster database. And most of the information is in the SQL trace table. So if I go there and view the data, we're looking at this raw now in the sysmaster SQL trace pseudo table. So you can see we've got quite a lot of other metrics in there, such as sorting information. So quite a bit to explore there. Also in Server Studio we have, once we've got SQL tracing running, instead of just looking at the SQL trace buffer as a whole, we can see what statements are being run by which session. So if I show the sessions there, if I group by database, for stores demo we only have the one session. So if I drill down into that with double click, we've then got the SQL statements currently in the SQL trace buffer associated with that session. Quite a few canned performance analysis reports are provided, which become available with SQL tracing enabled. So it's actually going to be those last four there. it's quite detailed. We can go directly in at a different level of detail by using the more specific reports listed under the reports node in the Explorer. All of these reports you can save it as a PDF.